If you're looking for some help hitting your ranked goals in Pokemon Pocket, you've come to the right place. The metagame has become fairly well defined in Shining Revelry. Let's go ahead and rank the best decks you can be playing to achieve whatever your goals may be. Let's start at the bottom of the barrel. The D tier decks that I've been running across Pokemon Pocket, still with some consistency, are Clodsire Grafaiai, Tinkaton Skarmory, and Leafeon Celebi. I actually think Clodsire exceeded my expectations I had going into this expansion. Its dark typing explicitly is really good into all the Giratina decks that are running around, and there's been a lot less Arceus as our metagame has developed. That being said, it does really struggle in the games where it doesn't have first energy advantage because you want to be hitting with Clod ASAP, and you are essentially need to assemble a 4-card combo of 2 different stage 1s, so Grafaiai can continue poisoning with coin flips from your bench so you can hit for meaningful amount of damage every single turn. Tinkaton Skarmory is actually a really powerful deck when everything comes together, but it's just pretty incredibly high variance. It's a stage 2 Pokemon which has variance baked into it, and then your attack also has coin flips every turn to top it off. Skarmory in particular I think is a pretty well positioned card in Pokemon Pocket, but unfortunately for Tinkaton enjoyers it is not remotely the most powerful pairing. We'll get to its better mate later on. Leafeon Celebi is mostly a remnant of formats past. Even with a cape, Celebi gets cleaned out by a Giratina's 130 damage in tandem with either a Darkrai chip shot or a red, meaning it's just not the finisher it used to be since it needs to close the game the turn it moves up, often not getting more than one attack into the common meta decks. Moving along, the pocket decks that I would say are C tier right now in our current metagame are Misty Cheese variations, i.e. 16 trainer Wugtrio and 18 trainer Articuno/Palkia, Dialga Arceus, our previous format's metagame powerhouse, Dragonite Giratina, Infernape variations, new EX Pikachu variations, and then Darkrai variations from previous seasons like Greninja and Weavile. While all the decks in the C tier, in my opinion, are a bit weaker than the things we're going to get to after them, I think it's worth calling out that all of these decks are pretty competitive and can be used to climb the ladder right now, in my opinion. In fact, my own climb through Ultra, as I mentioned closer to Masters, has been done with a number of the decks from this tier. So if you like the look of them and play them well, I think you can definitely find success with anything found here. I was actually pleasantly surprised when rank rolled out to find that the high trainer count Misty decks were actually far less popular than I was expecting them to be. Their power level is definitely a good bit lower from previous seasons, thanks to Giratina being able to consistently one-shot them before they can run things down. I would actually go so far as to say, while the Articuno and Palkia variations are still slightly more popular, the 16 trainer Wugtrio, in my experience, is actually better suited for this metagame. Getting to crack for effectively 150 damage when you attach your third energy has a ton of value and lets you keep up some amount of the time with the high HP mono basic EX decks that are popular at the top of the metagame. Unironically, Dialga Arceus actually might be the worst of the decks I'm reviewing in the C tier here today. While it's definitely got solid matchups into a lot of the more random stuff that we're going to be talking about in today's tier list, it really struggles into the big 3 decks right now, which in my opinion are Darkrai Giratina, Gyarados Manaphy, and 17 trainer Giratina variations. The addition of red to the metagame in tandem with Giratina's 130 damage attack, as well as Darkrai getting in chip shots, mean that Arceus can't full carry games because it often gets one-shotted on the backswing after it gets its first attack in. For the first time in Hoaglandia history, Dragonite is not headlining the D tier. While this Giratina variation is a little bit less consistent than the top dogs that we're going to talk about later, I do think it's quite powerful when things come together. The basic idea is relatively straightforward. You have Druddigon as a stalling lead that your opponent eventually gets 1 point for knocking out. Then ideally you move up a fully loaded Dragonite as a second single point hitter who can sometimes carry the game completely on its own with a Draco Meteor or 2, but even in the games where they're able to get through Druddigon and then Dragonite, they've now only amassed 2 points, which then lets you to use Giratina EX as your follow-up. Obviously, this deck list has stage 2 Pokemon in it and has a 2-color thing as well that needs to work out for you, so sometimes that doesn't come together, but it's also worth noting that Giratina is an incredibly powerful card, so you also occasionally win games where you go Druddigon into Giratina hard carry, so you're not all in on Dragonite, and the games where you get the deck's namesake card tend to be pretty powerful. Infernape actually has pretty sweet breakpoints into our existing metagame. 140 damage in tandem with Red lets you clear out most of the common threats in one shot, and 170 HP means you survive a Giratina Blast alongside a single chip shot from a Darkrai or an opposing copy of Red. I also think Heatran is a pretty solid lead Pokemon right now. Darkrai deal chip shot damage as they get built up, and cracking for 80 points of damage for just 2 energy cleans out a lot of these potent EXs really quickly. That being said, like I've talked about in a few of these other lower tier decks, Infernape is largely relying on a stage 2 Pokemon to be its finisher, and while those are more consistent post Iono and even communication sometimes, they're still not quite as consistent as just playing powerful basic Pokemon, leaving our Infernape down here in the lower tier. Our newest Pikachu EX is a card that feels incredibly close to being top tier if we can just find the right pairings for it. 150 damage is a massive blast that clears out a lot of things in our metagame, even giant stage 2s when you combine it with Red. That being said, you need more than just one clear to win a game of Pokemon Pocket, and it feels like this Pikachu kind of lacks an ideal pairing to go with it to pick up the other knockout you typically need to win a game. We've seen Magnezone as well as Electivire find some success with this card in the metagame, and I would wager one of these two is likely their current best pairing, but it's definitely a little bit lower power level overall than some of the higher tier things we're going to get to in a minute. Our last 2 decks in the C tier are Darkrai Greninja and Darkrai Weavile. These were format powerhouses in our previous metagames, and by the numbers from our community tournaments, they're not bad now per se, but they just aren't quite as powerful as the other Darkrai and Giratina decks that we'll be covering in the higher tiers here momentarily. Moving along to our B tier, I want to emphasize that I think all of the decks in this tier are quite competitive, and a number of them have been my most successful ones for climbing this season. I think this format is relatively well balanced overall, and the threshold between A and B is quite small right now. That being said, the B tier decks in Pokemon Pocket right now, in my opinion, are Meowscarada variations, Hitmonlee Fighting variations, Rampardos Lucario, Charizard EX Moltres, Arceus Carnivine, Skarmory Magnezone, and Primeape Fossils. Meowscarada decks, I think, are the best anti-meta decks you can be playing right now. They line up really well into the higher tier Darkrai and Giratina decks that are absolutely everywhere. I think the big thing that stands out in my mind from playing these various decks is just how consistent their stage 2 Pokemon can be, thanks to your basic cat drawing you up grass Pokemon for the first turn or 2 that it's in play, depending on how aggressive your opponent is being. There are 3 primary builds of Meowscarada decks running around, with the Beedrill line being the most common variation. Basically gives you a big EX stage 2 finisher behind your cats. The Wigglytuff variation has been gaining popularity in recent community tournaments, though, leaning all in on the single pointers and giving you more sustain. And the Executor variation, I think, is probably my personal least favorite. It kind of gives up percentage points in your better matchups to try and hedge things like the fighting decks that can be a little bit of trouble for Meowscarada since they don't have EXs that they lean on. With Gyarados being one of the best decks in the game, Hitmonlee variations have had their stock going up. Their ability to kick past a frontline card that's setting up into the attacker in the back, so you can then rip it forward with Cyrus before your opponent is expecting you to and knock it out before it attacks, is quite potent. These variations lean on various stage 2 Pokemon as their finisher behind the Hitmonlee. Gallade EX is easily the most popular. Its hefty HP pool and low energy requirements make it a potent threat. It's especially good when you're going first, since you hit that stage 2 evolution and your second energy at the same time to start dishing out damage in a very aggressive state. Magnezone and Rampardos have the upside of being only a single knockout point Pokemon, though, giving you a little bit more flexibility in the order your Pokemon make it to the front. And Rampardos being a fossil is both a boon and a negative, because it means that you're never going to lead on its basic as your starter, but it's also slightly less consistent to get assembled than the other stage 2s, so you can Pokeball for their basic. Rampardos Lucario without Hitmonlee is kind of last season's anti-meta deck. Sudowoodo is essentially a smaller version of Meowscarada, and while it's not quite as good as the cat into the EX heavy decks in the metagame, it's still got a pretty solid matchup into most of the big hitters. Its greatest weakness is that into non-EX decks, if your inconsistent Rampardos is nowhere to be found, you often lack closing power, leading to a little bit of matchup variance sparked by draw variance. Charizard Moltres has kind of become one of Pokemon Pocket's evergreen decks, being around the fringes of the format or a top deck in basically every meta we've had so far. I think it's solidly B tier in our current expansion. The new Charmander and Charmeleon that we got in Shining Revelry are actually pretty solid upgrades for this archetype. In the games where you don't have Moltres, you can now attack with Charmander for 1 energy, attack with Charmeleon for 2, attack with Charizard for 3, and then be ready to blast for its 200 organically instead of just having to ramp right up into it from the start. All of that in mind, stop me if you've heard this one before, Charizard is still a stage 2, so while it's one of the biggest hitters around that when it gets set up often can't be stopped, getting it set up is the trick that doesn't happen all of the time. Arceus Carnivine is a really solid aggressive choice right now that excels against the Manaphy decks, able to deal 50 damage in a single go. It goes toe to toe with a lot of the other bigger EX decks, but it does notably struggle against the Hitmonlee variations as they can tap the Arceus in your backline and yank it up with Cyrus to get 2 easy points in a lot of their games. Magnezone Skarmory is another excellent aggressive choice, and this is the deck I alluded to in the D tier that is Skarmory's ideal pairing as opposed to Tinkaton, who's more cute than good. This deck list occupies something of a pub stomper role, as I like to call it, in our existing metagame, as it's pretty poor against the #1 deck in the format right now, Darkrai Giratina, in my opinion, but it lines up pretty well into the everything else portion that's running around. Last up for the B tier, we have Primeape Fossils, which is definitely the most subjective measurement in this grouping for my list. This deck list hasn't put up really any tournament results, but it's been an absolute monster for me climbing on the Pocket ladder. Past the deck just feeling good into a number of the common matchups that you expect to play, you're pretty much favored anytime you have first energy advantage into the big 3, and even in the games where you don't have that, you can still scrape out some solid wins. This deck list is also pretty ladder optimal because your wins are often very quick, and even your losses tend to not drag out that long because you can predict a couple of turns ahead when you're locked out of the game and move on to the next one. Hitting with Promo Mankey for 30 into Primeape for 100, backed up by a copy of Red, clears out a ton of the EX Pokemon in the metagame very quickly, and you even catch a number of stray Magikarp out with Mankey's deal 30 on that first turn of the game. Next up, we have the A tier. These are some of the most powerful decks you can be playing in Pokemon Pocket right now, and if you want to rank up while winning the most games, these are objectively some of the best decks you can be playing right now, in my opinion. Pocket's A tier decks right now are Gyarados Manaphy, Giratina Mewtwo 17 Trainer, and Darkrai Giratina. Gyarados EX is probably one of the biggest winners in our current Pokemon Pocket card pool from Red being added to the game. Being able to clear 140 HP EX Pokemon in one blast and keep up with a cape when you have your supporter means you clean out a lot of things in the metagame in one shot. Gyarados Manaphy is easily the deck in this A tier that's the best into the other A tier decks. The one place it really struggles is when people can attack past to its bench with things like Hitmonlee, or when they're leveraging things like Skarmory or Carnivine that can knock out your lead Manaphy in a single shot. 17 Trainer Giratina is kind of the inverse of Gyarados in that it struggles a little bit into the other top decks here in the A tier, but it has incredibly strong matchups into almost all of the lower tier decks in this roundup. The tag team punch of Mewtwo threatening a side drive while Giratina charges itself up in the back is something that a lot of decks have a hard time overcoming. Darkrai Giratina probably has the most variation of these most popular decks, while a number of people playing this have elected to only play just Darkrai and Giratina. It's worth calling out that some folks play Druddigon as a Pokemon 5 and 6 as a stalling lead, and some others are playing Arceus alongside Dawn as a way to have a secondary attacker and also leverage that extra energy from Giratina in a different way that lets you be more aggressive. if I were to pick out a particular deck in our metagame that has the most balanced spread of matchups and is the most consistent, it would definitely be this one, which is also likely why, anecdotally, it's the deck I see most often climbing through Ultra. That just leaves the S tier. The absolute best deck in Pokemon Pocket right now, in my opinion, is whatever pet deck you've been enjoying climbing with that I didn't mention in this video that you were going to flame me for leaving out in the comments down below. Jokes aside, I actually think the current Pokemon Pocket metagame is quite reasonable, and it feels like all of the decks that are in the top tier, i.e. the A tier this time around, have good tools to allow us to attack them, so I don't think any of them can justifiably be called S tier, even if some of them tend to be a little bit more popular than some of the other things I ranked below them. I would love to hear whatever your favorite S tier decks are in the comments down below that you've been finding the most success with. I am almost to Masters myself, and once I get there, I'm going to be looking to experiment with a bunch of different things to see what sweet things might be lurking beyond the surface of this metagame. I appreciate everybody that made it all the way through to the video this far. If you enjoyed my roundup today, be sure to smash that like button. If you happen to be new here, consider subscribing to the channel. I do deck list roundups like this and daily off-meta deck highlights 7 days a week. I'd love to see you back again sometime. I hope your next pack is an excellent one. Catch you again soon.